Noragami is the manga that everyone forgot about. Now, when it comes to shonen anime in the 2010s, whenever I first really started to get into anime, of course, watch Naruto, watch Bleach, and that would lead me to getting into, I guess, a little bit less popular series. I don't want to say that these series weren't popular because that would just blatantly not be true, but series like Blue Exorcist, Noragami, and Magi really hooked me in. And while, of course, I did end up finishing Magi and now Noragami recently, Blue Exorcist is still ongoing, but Noragami is the one that captured me more than the other two did. Because I kind of just do an annual reread of Noragami. I have all the physical volumes. This is the series that I collected physically first before any other series, so there's a lot of sentimental value when it comes to Noragami for me. And I just think it's kind of funny because nobody really talks about it anymore. It was really big on Tumblr back in the day, which I only know because of so many just GIF memes that would get reposted everywhere. But recently, the manga did actually end, and I've seen like no one talk about it. So I do think that this would qualify as like a manga that so many different people forgot about. And there's a lot of good reasons for this because, of course, the author did get sick for a long period of time. And on top of that, this is a monthly series to begin with. So it's a little bit harder for this series to really pick up the pace and build up hype just because there's such a long waiting period. But making my way through these arcs, up first is pretty much the entire Shinki saga, which starts off with the Yukine arc, which is a pretty fantastic prologue arc if you ask me. Now, there's a lot of annoyances with this arc that can kind of be a barrier to entry when it comes to this series because Yukine is incredibly annoying at the beginning and Hiyori isn't exactly the strongest protagonist because technically she is the protagonist, even though it just makes more sense to kind of consider Yato in that position. It's kind of like Alibaba and Aladdin in Magi. It's very much that same type of dynamic, but the story is told kind of through Hiyori's perspective. So I think that that is an important distinction to make, even though it's not really that important, I guess. But when it comes to Yukine and his arc here, I think it is executed so incredibly well. And in the end, it makes the entire arc worth it. Dealing with Yukine's just annoyances as a character, it all comes full circle. And throughout his entire character arc, which is just, it's a very negative line. And then to see him kind of get to that point where he is rock bottom and then Yato is the one that pulls him out of that situation. It is just an incredible arc from just an emotional standpoint, and I think it's very entertaining as well with the build up to other arcs like the Bishamon arc, which comes up next. But before I get into the Bishamonten arc, the Rabo arc. This is anime exclusive, and I think a lot of people really like this, but as far as filler arcs go, this was actually very good compared to like the filler that we got in Blue Exorcist, where it was kind of just like them doing their own fan ending for the series, and it just didn't work at all. Now, this isn't exactly on the same par, I'd say, as Full Metal Alchemist, the first original anime, but I also like that it didn't try and do an ending kind of like Full Metal Alchemist did, which of course would lead to Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood. That's not necessary when it comes to the Rabo arc because it's not conclusive for the character of Yato or anything like that. And I enjoy that aspect a lot. All we got here was, some alluding to the past of Yato, which I think it really just enhances the story, especially from Yato's perspective. Just because a character that has a sort of close dynamic, it doesn't necessarily fit with the context of the manga because he's not really ever mentioned, but at the same time, there's a long history for Yato, so him having this relationship isn't exactly the most unexpected or just, illogical conclusion to come to. So when it comes to the Rabo arc, it's not the best thing ever, but we got a lot of cool action from it, and there's a lot of the most iconic scenes from Noragami come from this arc specifically. And like I said, the fight scene between Rabo and Yato at the very end of this anime only arc is pretty fantastic. So there's not too much to complain about here for a filler arc, that is. The Bishamon arc is one of my favorite in the series. I'm not sure just off the top of my head where I would rank it, if it's like top 5, top 3 or something like that, but it is a very solid arc, just building up the established relationship between Yato and Yukine, his character just in general, and how he becomes a blessed vessel, and just how that affects Bishamon's mentality at the time, because of course she has a very negative opinion of Yato at this point in time, and just in general she just seems like a very emotional character that was cool from her first appearance. And there's obviously a lot of history between the two characters, and as everything kind of comes to get revealed, and it's just how Kazuma, his dynamic with Yato, and how the history behind all of these characters kind of comes around, and we get the context behind everything, that's when it just makes you appreciate all the characters involved. The fact that Kazuma would go that far, and that Bishamon, her reaction, despite, maybe us not liking her as much, because of course she's reacting that way towards Yato. There's a lot of flaws with Bishamon as a character, but her reaction and her protectiveness over her Shinkis is just very respectable, I would say. And when it comes to Yato and Yukine, how they deal with this whole situation, and like I mentioned earlier, their dynamic with each other is just fantastic. This is one of the best examples of just expanding upon, the arc that Yukine went through in the first arc. So there's a ton to appreciate with this arc from a character writing perspective. But I will go ahead and say, Hiyori, still at this point in the story, like, you're not going to see me talk about her in a very positive way pretty much ever. Really, I'm not going to mention her a lot, because she's not really a bad character or a great character. She's just kind of a character. She is the eyes that we see this story through, but there's not a lot of care put into crafting overarching story for her. And I think that is a flaw on the series, but I also think that she's just not the focus, even though she is kind of the protagonist. It's a very weird storytelling technique, but it's something that I think it works decent enough. But then we get to the Heaven Saga, and this is where things start to get really focused around the crafter or father, just the main antagonist of the entire story of Noragami. And first is the Yomi or the Ebisu arc, and this is another arc that I thought was pretty fantastic, but for a lot of different reasons. We get introduced to the new god character of Ebisu, and I think that as far as new characters go, he becomes easily one of the most likable in the series, despite having, a very monotone type of expression, but it's just how his relationship quickly builds between him and Yato. But specifically, characters like Yukine and once again Hiyori do take more of a back seat with this arc, and I think that was the most necessary decision, because of course whenever it does come to going to Yomi, Yato does not bring Yukine with him, he brings Nora, and then so we get to see a little bit of that. But when it comes to just crafting this entire storyline, pun intended there, when it comes to like the death of Ebisu and how it impacts Yato, this was one of the more emotional moments early on within the story, and where we get to see just Yato dealing with, some more complex story beats that I really enjoyed when it comes to his connection with Ebisu and how it was handled here. Of course, we get to see Bishamon come around and be more involved towards the later half of this arc. There was a really weird creative decision when it comes to the anime versus the manga. In the manga, of course, Ebisu dies with Yato, and I think that makes the most sense. But then right afterwards in the anime, he dies in the arms of Bishamon. I don't know why that creative decision was made. I don't know if that was something that the anime directors just thought made more sense, or if it's something that the mangaka thought would have been better, so they had it changed or something. To me, it makes more sense, especially given the connection between the two, for him to die in Yato's arms. That just makes way more sense. But this storyline, it's not so much fantastic on its own. I really like it as a building arc because it just sets a lot of storylines into play for future arcs, and I think it does that very well. But then we get to probably my second favorite arc in the entire story, just because it is a flashback arc, and that is, I say it all the time, that's my bread and butter. That is what I love the most when it comes to a lot of these stories. I think most of the time they're just done very well. It's just for some reason it's like a cheat code to just making an amazing arc. And I think here, especially with how deep and rich Yato's history is when it comes to Yato and Sakura and all of these other characters that we see early on, and how it crafts the story of Yato, his relationship with Nora, and how father manipulates the both of them. I think it all just works so incredibly well. I'm going to stop saying works so incredibly well because I feel like I say that all the time. So I've got to find a new phrase, a new word, something like that. But this, it hits really hard. And then there's the hospital arc, which is just the prologue to the War with Heaven arc. And this arc, when it comes to that, introducing a lot of the concepts and a lot of the story beats that would play a major role in the War with Heaven arc, I think it does a pretty great job, especially when it comes to the characterization and the development of Bishamon, and just kind of increasing the presence of Father, or the Crafter, as an antagonist, because he's pretty great here. I mean, for a while I really liked Father as an antagonist, and that's mostly due to this arc and the War with Heaven arc. Now, I don't know if I'd say that his character fell off with the final arc, but he didn't have that same type of presence, I guess is really the best word to describe it. He really didn't have as much when it came to the final arc. It was just kind of like we got a repeat of a storyline, but I'll get to that in a second. But when it comes to the hospital arc and the little bit that we get where Bishamon is trying to actively kill the Crafter and he's getting more involved in the story, the stakes at this point in the story, they were pretty high, and especially when it comes to just Bishamon's story and her overarching storyline. I mean, this is one of the best moments for her, and it's really important to also building up the Crafter. But that does lead directly into the War with Heaven arc. Now, this pretty much just continues off of everything that was already important in the hospital arc, and it just keeps things going. Bishamon plays a major role in this arc as well, where she does actively end up going against Heaven in a certain perspective to try and kill the Crafter. And of course, he's manipulating things while also being in the front lines, basically. He's just, at this point in time, the Crafter, or Father, he is just such a fantastic and charismatic villain at this point in the story, and I really did love him here. But then, of course, there's a lot of other stuff when it comes to Yato and his dynamic that would come into play with Take Mikazuchi. That definitely took me a couple of times to try and pronounce. But when it comes to everything, the different story beats that are going on in this arc, all of them I pretty much love. This is the best arc in the story to me. I think it is without a doubt the climax of the story. The height that is reached here is not reached in the final arcs of the story. This is just the absolute peak in terms of storytelling for me, peak, and definitely when it comes to stakes. I mean, the ending of this arc, where so many regalia that are important to the story, their head is pretty much on the line. Now, of course, there was a little bit of a cop-out when it comes to Tengen's regalia, but that is such a minor gripe and something that just didn't really bother me, but I figured I might as well mention it because I could just see some people pointing at that as a means of criticism. But when it comes to the other aspects of this arc, Bishamon getting a new blessed vessel to specifically fight the Crafter, that way Kazuma doesn't get in any way revealed the secret. It makes her character, like, she tries to do something pretty cold and heartless, and it just doesn't really end up working out for her, because that's just not the type of character that she is. And then just overall, this is easily the best arc in the story, and I would say that Yato versus Takemikazuchi is the best fight in the series as well. Like, there's a whole lot of bests that happen in this arc. Now, when it comes to this final arc, it's more like a final saga because it's the Stray arc, the Oharai arc, I know I pronounced that wrong, you make fun of me if you want, and the actual final arc. This includes just so many different aspects, the backstory behind Father, if we find out if he's a good antagonist or if he is a great one. I think he's kind of in the middle of the two. And then we find out, of course, everything going on with Yukine. He goes kind of through a similar arc as he did in the first arc of the story with the actual Yukine arc itself. So there is a lot that goes on here that you can break down. But specifically when it comes to Father, if he's a great antagonist or not, I think that especially with his backstory, you're going to understand where he's coming from, and that's arguably one of the most important aspects to a main villain character. Now, they don't all have to be sympathetic, but I think with Father's situation, that's obviously what they were hinting at throughout the entirety of the manga, that he is a sympathetic antagonist, a very human one that just wants to get revenge. That's pretty much his entire setup, and I think they paid it off pretty well. I do think it probably could have been a little bit better, but I think, the execution is there, it's fine, it's good, and I think it makes him a very good character by the end of it. Now, when it comes to the actual ending here, though, this is one of the, not the biggest story beat to talk about. The chapter before, because I did read this series as it came out monthly, the chapter before, the stakes were very high. It looked like we were going to get a much more bittersweet ending than most people probably thought. Just based on the chapter before. That's where it led me to a lot of theorizing. And then I kind of guessed that the story would go back on a lot of the decisions it was kind of leading up to making. And it pretty much did that. There were a lot of, I don't know how to really explain it, but there was a lot of backpedaling when it came to the final chapter itself. I was really hoping we'd get more bittersweet, but it was more just like, this is a very happy ending. And I do feel kind of just like in the middle about it. I'm a centrist on this ending specifically because I do like some things that happen, but then again, on the other side, I think it could have been much better. And that's pretty much how I feel about this series when it comes to that final chapter. I really enjoyed the final arc. I really enjoyed pretty much every arc in the story, but that final chapter, I think that there could have definitely been improvements. But yeah, that's pretty much it. I went through every arc in the story, the characters, I talked about them a good amount. Of course, artistically, this is just one of the most beautiful manga out there. Two both female artists. One got sick for a very long time. They recovered, and they still managed to put out just some absolutely incredible artwork. But yeah, that's going to be it. Thank you guys for watching. Tell me what you guys thought in the comments below.